Hello, everyone. You're listening to The Right Side of Gaming. Today, we're discussing whether Life is Strange True Colors is too political. And if you don't want to listen through this whole video, I will make it really easy. I think no, it was not. But if you're not aware, that was a criticism of the previous game, Life is Strange 2. For a lot of people, specifically on the right, they felt like the game was a little heavy handed in how it addressed politics, that it was a little bit more politically oriented than previous games. It had a very particular perspective, and that it wasn't as good as previous games at creating characters. So, to break it down, Life is Strange 2 focused on two Mexican American brothers and their family, starting with a pre 2016 election to a post 2016 election world. Racism was a big focus in the course of the game. They meet a lot of people that the developers would probably say are conservative. I'm not sure they really understand what the people on the other side believe that well. Um, but they also had some people that were religious that may not have been treated well either. And then there were some people that were, genuinely racist, and those I think we can all agree should be condemned. But whenever I try to tackle serious issues, racism being the big one, it's very clear that this side good, this side bad. And by that I mean, this side may feel a specific way about border security or political candidate or whatever. Not, you know, I'm not advocating for racism. No one's going to do that. I mean, sort of how they portrayed some of the topics revolving around it. They said, this is how you're supposed to feel about border security. This is how you're supposed to feel about, undocumented immigrants, illegal immigration, whatever you want to call it. This is how you're supposed to feel about a political candidate. This is how you're supposed to feel about a border wall. They had very specific ideas that they were trying to push. In previous games, like the first Life is Strange and some of the prequel games, issues came up very naturally. They were part of the story, and it wasn't necessarily this overt thing. I think outside of the alcohol and drug use, which I'm not especially a fan of, particularly for characters that I think were technically minors, because this is sort of a recurring theme in a lot of the games. I think the first game did really well with a lot of the issues that they tackled. They weren't necessarily political issues, some were more moral debates, though I guess you could say even that's political. And others where it's like, okay, this is something that's in the story, but I don't think it's something that we have to debate. Like someone, I don't want to spoil it, even though it's been a while, especially since it's being re-released, or remastered or whatever. But I think we can agree that, say, kidnapping and killing someone isn't really a debatable issue. That's wrong. But stuff like whether or not you should help someone off themselves, that I think is a moral debate. I don't think it's necessarily something where like one side says this is what's right, this is what's wrong. It's not something that we have pop up a lot in American politics anyway. But there's definitely a lot of like philosophical debates and papers and things like that written about it. I don't feel like they were trying to push a specific ideology on me either. And yes, these games do tend to have some LGBT representation in there, and it does pop up, but it's not necessarily something where I feel like it's being forced on you. Some of it's easy to miss, some of it you kind of get to choose what you're doing. But I don't really feel like any of it was really in your face or anything. So, how does this one stack up to those? Honestly, I'd say it did really well. I'd say it's much more like the first game. I don't think there was ever any part where I felt like they were saying, this is what you should believe. I don't think there was ever any part where I felt like they were pushing a specific ideology or political stance on me. I want to avoid spoilers, but there were some heavier topics in there, like dementia, some that maybe not as heavy, but could still really hit home for some people. Foster care, for example. There was death in the game. I feel like that's kind of a Life is Strange staple. At some point, you're going to have to deal with loss. There were some things that might have been a little bit more political, but they weren't really the focus of the game or the narrative. And if they got touched on, it was very briefly as, say, a single line or two from one of the memories you can find or from one of your social media tags. So it's not even stuff that you had to see or engage with, but there was the issue of environmentalism that came up. But as one of those sort of little throwaway things. They're not necessarily saying it's good or bad that what was happening. Not even something that they really addressed much in the story. They went somewhere else. They just sort of acknowledge that that might be a concern for some people. Fair enough. They touched very slightly on LGBT stuff. There was one character that doesn't even show up in the game that was trans. And they, again, were just there for a couple of lines and something you don't even have to interact with. And yes, the character does have the choice between a male or a female love interest. But it's your choice. It's not something that they force on you. It's kind of something that you decide happens. You get to pick your orientation. You get to pick who you romance, if anyone. I think a lot of the political or hot button issues in here got left out, and what did sort of sneak in was stuff that it's up to you. Like, you can deal with it, you can not, but it's not really necessarily a major part of the story. I think the focus on True Colors is less specific issues and more emotions. There's a lot of anger and sadness and fear. And the game really focuses more on how you feel those emotions, why you feel those emotions, how to understand those emotions, how you work through those emotions, how you help other people work through those emotions. And I don't think happiness or sadness or fear or anger or grief or whatever is inherently political. And I think that's something that everyone, regardless of who you are, has to deal with. So I think they chose a really good option there. Because again, whatever you deal with in the game felt fairly natural. There wasn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. I don't think any of it was inherently political or not in the major story. There might be some commentary on how powerful certain businesses have gotten. I think that's about the extent of it, and I feel like that doesn't necessarily have to be a divisive political thing, although I think people do have very specific ideas about what should and shouldn't be allowed with companies. I know that they sort of brushed onto some legal topics, but I don't think they really explained them well in game. I'd be really tempted to talk about what, but I know there's one example in particular that comes to mind that I don't think people understand that that's what was going on in the story and why certain things could or couldn't be done. At least there was sort of a legal issue that popped up. Again, more of it is focused less on politics and things like that and more on people and emotions and relationships. So honestly, I think this was not a particularly political game. If this is one where maybe you were kind of putting it off or dreading it or unsure because of the last game, I think this is a safe one to play. This is one where I was honestly unsure. I was like, you know what? I love the series. I'll take the risk. I'll play it. And I'm really glad I did. There's a lot of very likable characters. There's actually some really fun little side quests or side stories you can engage in if you choose to. And I was really happy with how some of them turned out. I was like, finally, yes. The game itself is pretty well paced. I think, at least it felt to me like it was shorter than some of the previous games. If you wanted to just go and do one playthrough, I don't know about how long it takes compared to the others to do like every single possible option. But if you just want to play from the start of chapter 1 to the end of chapter 5, you can do that, and I think it takes less time. Speaking of, you can actually play through the whole thing all at once rather than having to wait for the next episode to release, which honestly I really liked, being able to play through the game, not having to wait a couple months for the next episode to come out and then try to remember, okay, where was I? What was happening? As I was playing, whatever I had done previously, the memory of it was still there. The emotional impact of it was still there. And I think not having that break really helps, especially when the game is focusing so much on the emotions of both the characters and the player. I can't really speak a whole lot to graphics. I mean, it's not really ever been a big deal for me. I thought the game looked good. There's someone else will pop in and it's like, oh man, that's so low def. Like, I have no idea. You have some pretty good audio in there. A lot of it is very indie, but that's probably what they could afford. Controls, for the most part, were pretty easy, pretty good. I really wish we had a faster run at some points, just because it feels like it takes forever to get from one part of the game to another. There are some, for the walking / running speed, some relatively big areas you might have to traverse at times. But overall, I think it's a really good game. I think they really handled the issues inside of it pretty well, and I think it's one of those where even if you're conservative, even though that this is a very left-leaning company, at least it seems like these days, you can still play it pretty well. Again, there's like previous games, definitely kind of pro alcohol and pro drug use. So if that's not really your thing, I'm sorry. It's not particularly prevalent in there. You know that your character has done both, and it references them doing that. You see them drink a little bit, but you don't actually see them take any of the drugs. Although there's some text you can read post gummies. But other than that, I think everything handled pretty well, and I don't think there's anything particularly objectionable in here that anyone on the right or that listens to me or whatever would have to worry about. That's all I had for today. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you want to leave a like, comment, subscribe, that'd be great. If not, that's okay too. I understand. I would love to hear what you guys think if you've played this game, or maybe your thoughts on some of the previous games. I really enjoy the franchise. Again, number 2, not so much, but Life is Strange, Before the Storm, The Adventures of Captain Spirit, and now True Colors, I think were all absolutely amazing. Regardless, I hope you guys have an awesome day, and I will catch you next time.